Okay, thanks so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. Really happy to be doing this tonight, um, and I hope that you're all able to enjoy the presentation. So I'm going to be talking about winter birding in Ontario, and I hope by the end of tonight I'll have convinced you all that if you're an Ontario resident, that you need to do nothing else except stay here for the rest of the winter and winters in the future, because the birding here is so awesome. And if you're joining us from outside of the province, I hope I convince you that at some point in the future, you need to come and spend some time birding here in Ontario, because we've got everything you could want. So my outline today, I'm going to be telling you why winter birding is so awesome. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of winter birding and a few tips and tricks. But the focus of my presentation is really about some target species and target destinations for winter birding. And I focused the talk on Southern Ontario. Northern Ontario is a whole other presentation, but also amazing and a place we should all be birding at as much as possible in winter because it's so much fun. But focusing on Southern Ontario tonight. All right, and then I'll of course have time for some questions at the end. So when you think of winter in Ontario, this you can be forgiven if this is what comes to mind. It can be pretty snowy, it can be pretty cold, and it's easy to just want to curl up by a fire and stay inside. But there's so much more to winter than just the snow and cold. It is a pretty beautiful place when we've got this nice fresh snow, and not just scenery, but the birding is pretty awesome. It's the time of year when some of our coolest birds show up. A personal favorite of mine is the northern shrike, and we really don't get to see these any other time of the year. So we get some pretty sweet birds like shrikes, and everybody goes nuts for owls, of course, and snowy owls. What's not to like about them? They're huge. They're awesome predators. They're sort of mysterious. They're nomadic, and they look cool. So we get some pretty kick-ass birds in the winter. And for me, one of the things I love about winter is getting to feed birds, running bird feeders and sitting inside and watching birds, but seeing what comes. You get to enjoy seeing stuff up close, right out your door, if you're out your window, if you're lucky enough to have feeders like that. But it gives people a chance to study birds up close that you wouldn't necessarily get to see otherwise. I particularly have a fondness for watching juncos and looking at how each individual junco is a little bit different. And with the feeder birds in the winter come some rarities, and we can always count on one or two varied thrushes at a feeder somewhere in Ontario. So we get some pretty cool, sort of unusual things showing up at bird feeders. And the great thing about these sort of stakeout rarities in the wintertime is they usually stay put for the entire winter. So when a varied thrush shows up in mid-December, it's probably still going to be there in February. So the extended stay means lots of people get to enjoy these birds, and a lot of you may recognize this one from Bark Lake last winter. Now the stakeout and the rarities aren't just feeder birds. Some pretty spectacular things like harlequin ducks are also regular sort of rarities in Southern Ontario in the winter. And ducks in general really are a pretty awesome part of winter birding in Ontario. This is probably one of the most common birds you could find in Southern Ontario in winter, mallard. But if you stop and look at them, they are pretty spectacular. And the cool thing about ducks in winter is this is when they're at their brightest. The males are trying to court females in the middle of the winter and pair up before they head north in the spring. So it's a nice bonus of winter is that the ducks are visible and at their brightest. And another great aspect of birding in winter in Ontario are the winter hawks. and owls. Um, this is a light morph rough-legged hawk, and this is definitely one of my favorite species that I associate with winter in Ontario, where I grew up just outside of Waterloo in the sort of Linwood area. We've got a lot of agricultural fields and big concentrations of rough-legged hawks, and it's one of these things that I think Ontario birders take for granted, that you can go out and see a dozen or 2 dozen rough-legged hawks pretty easily, and not many other people in the world can do that easily. So it's pretty cool. Get to see these Arctic breeding hawks come down. And in southern Ontario, we even have a few red-shouldered hawks as well. And this particular individual is one of my favorite individual birds that I've ever seen. This one showed up near my parents' house out in a little town called Hawksville, and we found it in the December of 2003, and it came back every single winter for 11 winters. So we got to know it pretty well, and got to know its different patterns, and it was pretty cool part of winter for a decade to be able to go and see this bird. And it's not just hawks. The other big predator birds that you get to see in winter are owls. They become more conspicuous if you're lucky, like I was about 10 years ago. You might even get them to come in and hunt the small mammals that are attracted to your birdseed, like this barred owl was. So there's a lot of reasons to like birding in the winter, and the birds obviously are a big part of that. Now, it's not without its challenges. It can be pretty cold. It can be pretty snowy. So you've got to deal with those challenges. The picture on the right of the screen there is my road a couple of winters ago after a big snowfall. So you do have to worry about getting around for sure, and being prepared for driving in the winter is one of the big challenges. I remember one winter about 10 years ago, a couple of birders were coming to meet my brother Ken and I. They were going to pick us up at like 7 in the morning, and then we were going to drive up to Algonquin Park. And we were wondering where they are. Where are they? They hadn't arrived yet. And then finally we got a phone call, and they had managed to put their car partially into a ditch going around a turn. Luckily it wasn't too bad, but we had to figure out where they were. I remember they weren't exactly sure where they were, but we found them in the dark, and Ken and I came and helped them push the car out of the ditch. And then the rest of that birding trip was pretty successful. And another fun, well, I guess as fun as it can be with minor accidents, but I remember taking a couple friends from southwestern United States. They were in Toronto for the year, and they really wanted to see some snowy owls. So I was taking them out looking for snowy owls, and we came across somebody who had slid partially off the road, in a rural part of southwestern Ontario. And so we got out of our car and helped push the vehicle back on the road. And the guys from New Mexico and California, when they got home, when we got back to the house, we of course had seen a couple snowy owls too, and they just thought that was the most Canadian experience they could ever have had, getting to see snowy owls, rough-legged hawks, and helping push somebody out of a ditch. So you can make those situations into not such bad situations sometimes. So as far as tips for birding in the winter, one of the best things is to make sure you're prepared with your gear. So make sure you dress warmly, dress in layers, and your vehicle. You need to be prepared with your vehicle. But it's really important to pay attention to the habitat, and I guess that's really no different than in the summertime. But in the winter, it's still very important. You want to focus, especially if you're looking for songbirds in like forested areas or in edges of fields and stuff. You really want to pay attention to habitat. Look for real sheltered areas, In this picture, we were doing the Kitchener Christmas bird count, and it's this little secret spot that we know of where we get into this little creek valley, and it's surrounded by really dense cedars and spruce trees on each side. So it's got a lot of real important features that can attract, especially lingering species. So it's got the creek stays open because it's moving, so open water. There's a whole lot of berry bushes in this valley as well, so there's abundant food source, and the conifers and the valley itself provide really good shelter. So those are all real important features for finding areas where you might have more songbirds than more exposed areas. And another feature of this area is it gets a lot of sun first thing in the morning. And often if you can find a spot like that on a real cold, clear, sunny winter morning, find a spot with some shelter, but that gets the early morning sun. And if you keep an eye on those areas, you'll often find owls and hawks and other birds just sort of sitting on the edge of the bush, soaking up that little bit of sun. Another big tip is you really gotta work sometimes in the winter to find birds. There definitely are fewer birds around than in the spring or the summer and the fall, and so you've got to do as much as you can to bring them out and see what's around. So always be looking for chickadees. A lot of other birds will travel with chickadees. If you hear a chickadee, stop and make sure you do lots of pishing to try to get the chickadees and any other birds that are around, get them to come out. So lots of pishing. And if you're in an area where there's lots of people, like a park or something like that, often chickadees will come right into your hand if you've got some seeds. So always be looking for chickadees. Is a pretty important point when doing winter birding in Ontario. Another thing to keep in mind is that roadsides can be really good, especially after a fresh snowfall. After a fresh snowfall, you often get birds come into the road where the snow might have been cleared off by snowplows already. That's what this flock of eastern meadowlarks is doing. This was down on Lake Erie one winter a few years ago, and you can see they're kind of concentrated along the edge of the road there. But even with a snowfall, you'll often get a push of birds into feeders and things like that. So pay attention to the weather as well. And I kind of mentioned it already with the open water, but open water can't be understated how important it is, especially for ducks, believe it or not. If you wanted to look for ducks, you got to find open water, and of course, if you're doing ducks, scope's really helpful because they're sometimes further away. So those are a few tips, and I want to move on now to talk about some of my favorite winter birding destinations in the province. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Algonquin, and before I say too much more about Algonquin, I just want to say I'm going to do about 4 or 5 locations, and so I can't cover the whole province, obviously, and there's lots of other great places for birds in winter that I'm not going to mention today. And if you're wondering why I didn't mention your favorite spot, it's because I wanted to keep it a secret so nobody else comes to it. So just want to get that out of the way. And okay, so let's talk about Algonquin. So Algonquin Park is definitely one of our most famous winter birding destinations. The park itself is huge. It's almost 8,000 square kilometers. Most of that, though, is pretty inaccessible, especially in the wintertime. There's only really the only road that really goes through the park is Highway 60, and the map that we're seeing is the Highway 60 corridor. But that's still about 60 kilometers. So it's a big area. Now there's 2 main things that people are going to Algonquin for in the winter: winter finches, and then the Algonquin specialties. And I'll talk about those in a second. But I want to just focus while we're on the map on sort of the main areas that I like to bird when I'm birding in Algonquin in the winter. So I usually start at the West Gate. So I usually work west to east. So the Western Uplands Backpacking Trail is at kilometer marker 3. And it's, as you can see, it's a huge trail. So don't try to hike it, at least not the whole thing. When I'm birding here in the winter, I just stop in the parking lot. There's some conifers right behind the parking lot that can have interesting birds. But there's also, if you start walking the trail, the first sort of 500 meters to kilometer, go through some really good spruce forest, and it can be a great spot to find the Algonquin specialties, but also for winter finches. So that's an easy spot to stop, and it's one that a lot of people ignore, unfortunately. Okay, so if you keep moving down Highway 60, you'll get to the Mizzy Lake Trail, and you can hike the whole trail. It's about 10 kilometers. But some years the Arrowhan Road is plowed, and if the road is being plowed in the winter, and it's safe to do so, and you can drive up, and there's an old railway bed, and the top part of the Mizzy Lake Trail actually follows the old railway bed. So you can park at the intersection with the railway bed, and some years you can even drive down the railway bed. If you can do that, then the top end of Mizzy Lake Trail can be quite good for all the sort of regular winter stuff that you're looking for. Otherwise, you'll have to do the hike or just bird along the Arrowhan Road. All right, now you keep moving further east. Mule Lake Campground's open year-round. There will be campers there all winter. So if you can go in there, some of them often have bird feeders that they're maintaining. And if there are, then there will certainly be more birds here than you'll see elsewhere in the park. Algonquin's really unique because it's all this sort of natural landscape, and it's not like the rest of southern Ontario where there's houses and cities and people everywhere. So the birds that are in Algonquin Park really are acting like birds are supposed to, and not eating sort of human foods. So that they're sort of concentrated in places where there are human supplemented food sources like Mule Lake Campground. But the area is also good for, in particular, Canada jay, especially when there's feeders going. You should be able to get Canada jay in there, and sometimes black-backed woodpecker and all the finches are possible there as well. Okay, further east is the Spruce Bog Boardwalk, and this is a short trail. It's only about a kilometer, and this is like if you only have time for one thing, Spruce Bog Boardwalk is probably the place to go. Right at the parking lot, you often get Canada jays right in the parking lot, and then you have a good shot at basically all the Algonquin specialties by walking the trail, and the finches flying over. And the visitor center is pretty much across the highway from the boardwalk, and the driveway itself is good for finches. And then there's feeders at the visitor center, which are a must-stop place in the wintertime to get some finches. Now, the last place to try is Opiongo Road. And again, in some years, the road will not be plowed, so you won't be able to drive up. If it is, it's often plowed up to a gate kind of halfway up, so you can park there. The best area I find for winter birding in Algonquin on Opiongo Road is from about the gate up about a kilometer. So if you can concentrate on that area, it's probably best. So I already mentioned sort of the targets for most birders in Algonquin in winter are finches and the Algonquin specialties. So I've got a pair of red crossbills here. I photographed these last winter along the visitor center driveway. And the finch numbers really vary from year to year depending on food sort of availability across North America. So some years there's a lot, and there can be a lot of all the different species of finches. Last winter was one of those years where pretty much everything was around in good numbers. This year is looking like it probably won't be very good in Algonquin for finches, but the good news is that's because most of them have come south, so you might not have to go very far to get your finches this winter. But red crossbills and white-winged crossbills, the two species, they don't really come into the feeders. Instead, you're more likely to get them, like I did, on the driveway or along the road, picking up salt and sand, or feeding up in conifers. Now the feeders, as I said, are a must visit spot. This is the visitor center feeders, or one of them, and you can see I've got a flock of evening grosbeaks here. There's basically always evening grosbeaks, even in poor finch years. There's usually some evening grosbeaks in Algonquin, and if they're anywhere in the park, they'll be at the visitor center. But in a decent year for pine grosbeaks, there should be pine grosbeaks here. And same with if there's red poles and pine siskins, they'll be in at the visitor center feeders hopefully too. Now the Algonquin specialties I mentioned, or I kept mentioning, include Canada jay, and if you bring some granola bars or something with you, you'll get them to come in and feed from your hand, and you'll be able to notice most of the Canada jays along Highway 60 are color banded like this one as part of a long-term study of their populations in the park. Now, Canada jay is pretty much the easiest of the specialties. Blackback woodpeckers, definitely harder, but I think easier than the next two. The trick with blackback woodpeckers is to listen for them flaking bark. That's their typical feeding mechanism. They flake little bits of bark off and then look for insect larvae underneath. So you can hear that sort of tapping and flaking from quite far away if it's calm out. So those are the best days to listen for blackback woodpeckers. And then once you hear a woodpecker, try to track it down, which can be pretty challenging. Sometimes if you take a step off of the packed down trail, you fall down, waist deep in snow. So keep that in mind before you start running off the trail trying to track down a woodpecker. Now the Algonquin specialty I find the most frustrating to locate is spruce grouse, because they'll spend a lot of time just sitting very still, sometimes up fairly high up in a tree. Sometimes they're feeding up in the tree. Other times they're walking around on the ground, but they don't make a whole lot of noise in the winter. The most likely noise you'll hear is the sound of their wings as they're flying up or down. So you just gotta be patient. Spruce bog boardwalk's a good spot to find them. Sometimes you gotta walk that trail like 10 times, but hopefully you'll get one when you're looking. Now the last Algonquin specialty to mention is the boreal chickadee. These guys have become much harder in the last few years. They may be declining because of climate change, and it might be a species we completely lose from the park eventually, but there are still some in the park. Spruce Bog's a good spot, and Opiongo Road is another good spot. The trick for these is to find chickadee flocks, especially in areas with lots of black spruce, and do lots of pishing, and listen for their more nasal calls. And if you hear them, then try to track them down in the flock. Often, though, I find boreal chickadees are a little shyer than the blackcaps when they're in a flock like that. And sometimes you'll get a flock of chickadees, and if you do, pay attention to the ones that are kind of hanging back on the edge of the flock. And those ones sometimes turn out to be boreal chickadees. All right, so we're going to move south into Ontario's banana belt, the north shore of Lake Erie. And I'm not talking about a very specific spot to bird here, more just sort of a general area and strategy and things to look for. This is a really fun place, I think, for birding in the winter. It's really underbirded. There's not a whole lot of people that live down here, especially close to the lake shore. But it seems like most birders don't spend much time down here, even though it's not too far from London, Hamilton, and Kitchener-Waterloo. Most people don't venture down here for some reason. But because it's so much further south than the rest of the province and slightly warmer winter temperatures, you get a lot more of the lingering migrants down here, like sparrows and yellow-rumped warblers and hermit thrushes. So it's definitely a favorite place for my family and I to go down and go birding in the winter. We like to cruise the roads, especially after a heavy snowfall, like I mentioned earlier. Watch the roadside flocks. There'll be huge flocks of tree sparrows and juncos. So drive slowly and scan through them. You'll find, song sparrows and swamp sparrows are pretty regular, but things like Savannah sparrow, you have a good shot at finding. And once in a while, if you're really lucky, you'll find something like this, a Vesper sparrow. So there's always goodies to find down along Lake Erie if you put the effort in. And while you're birding down there, keep an eye up because there are golden eagles that spend the winter now down in southwestern Ontario, especially. They cover a big area every day, or they can. So you got to be lucky to see it just as it happens to go over. But they're around for sure, and it's possible they're actually hunting wild turkeys now in southern Ontario. Now, it's not just the lingering land birds along Lake Erie that are worth going down for. Lingering water birds, as long as there's open water, you'll have some water birds that stick around down there. And you can get pretty impressive flocks of sandhill cranes now, especially around Long Point. They regularly have a flock of 1,500 or 2,000 cranes lingering well into December. And in warm winters like last year, there was hundreds, pretty much all year, all winter, that stuck around. So definitely keep an eye out for cranes and other lingering water birds. All right, so at the east end of Lake Erie, the lake drains into the Niagara River, and this is another one of our real famous winter birding spots. And most of you Ontario birders have probably been to the Niagara River and Niagara Falls for winter birding. The attraction, of course, is the falls itself, but the whole river gets incredible numbers of gulls. The three big ones are herring gull, Bonaparte's gull, and ring-billed gull. All three of them occur in globally significant numbers, which is why the Niagara River is designated as a globally significant important bird and biodiversity area. And it's pretty impressive to go down there and see tens of thousands of gulls swirling around the river. But of course, all the birders there are looking through these more common species, looking for especially the white-winged gulls like Iceland gull and glaucous gull. Those are two that you're pretty likely to turn one or two up in the winter. Now the peak times for the gulls, especially for numbers, is early December, late November, early December. If you are going back later in the winter, you'll see much fewer gulls, but you can actually find pretty decent numbers of these white-winged gulls, really more so later in the winter. And basically any of these spots, with the exception of Algonquin that I'm mentioning today, if you find gull flocks, you got to look through them to try to find these goodies. Now, the river is not just awesome for gulls; it's really good for water birds in general. I always associate common loons with the Niagara River in winter, so keep an eye out for loons and other water birds like ducks and swans. And if you're walking around on any of the trails in the sort of forested areas along the river, you're quite likely to come across tufted titmouse, which this is about the most common, the place in the province where they're the most common. All right, we're coming out of the river, and we're gonna go to the west end of Lake Ontario now. And again, this is a big area. I'm not going to talk about specific locations. Basically, you can stop anywhere along the lakefront in the west end of Lake Ontario, and you're going to see a lot of ducks. Now, there's lots of other real cool birds to see in the winter in this part of the province, but the claim to fame is the big duck concentrations, and this area is actually also identified as a globally significant, important bird and biodiversity area. Now, the most abundant species of duck that you're going to find is long-tailed duck. There's counts up to 200,000 long-tailed ducks within the area. It's not uncommon to pick a random point, especially sort of the Stony Creek portion of the area. It's not uncommon to go out and walk out to the edge of the water and put your binoculars up and see 10,000 long-tailed ducks swirling about. It's pretty spectacular. So you're not going to miss long-tailed duck, that's for sure. But there's really nowhere else that you're going to see numbers like this. So it's pretty amazing. And I think it's definitely something that Ontario birders take for granted, the huge duck concentrations that we're treated to every winter. In with the longtails are good numbers of white-winged scoters like this one, but you can get all three scoters pretty easily in the winter in the area. And this one, like a lot of the ducks this time of year, are feasting on zebra mussels. And it's really important. Birders are always staring through flocks of scoters because they're trying to turn up more unusual species like king eiders. And when king eiders show up, there's usually a few every winter. They're virtually always in flocks of scoters. Not always, but that's your best bet, is to sort through the flocks of scoters with the hope of finding a king eider. There's usually one or two Barrow's goldeneye and harlequin ducks as well to reward the patient searchers. So there's good reason to be searching through these flocks of ducks to look for the more rare species. As you're driving from spot to spot or walking from spot to spot, you're also in one of the best places in the province for northern mockingbirds. So keep an eye, especially in places where there's lots of berry bushes or berry trees. Okay, the final location that I want to talk about is another very famous winter birding destination in Ontario. It's called Amherst Island, and Amherst is just west of Kingston, about half an hour west of Kingston, and to add to the excitement, you have to take a ferry to get there, which in my books automatically makes it one of the coolest places you can go to. So you grab the ferry in Millhaven, and then it's only about a 20-minute ferry ride. It's not very long. Now Amherst is a really awesome birding spot all year round, and Ontario birders, I think most of them don't realize how good it is outside of the winter. Most of them come here in the winter, but unfortunately never get a chance to come birding here in the rest of the year. But in the winter, it is at its probably at its best. It certainly got the most sought after species in the wintertime, and what people are coming for are hawks and owls especially. And you can see on the map the little inset map near the east part of the island. That is the Owl Woods, which is it's a little woodlot made up of jack pines and spruce trees, and it's a spot where some winters, like a couple dozen owls of 3 or 4 or 5 species even could be found. And on the island as a whole, the number of owls and hawks can be pretty incredible. It really varies from year to year. It depends on how many small mammals there are around, so how much food there is. And the good news for everybody listening tonight is it sounds like it's a really good year for meadow voles on the island. So I guess that depends on your perspective. If you're a meadow vole, it's not a good year. because probably it means there's a lot of hawks and owls that are going to be showing up. But that's good news for us. Anyways, the birding strategy on the island, I always go basically straight to the owl woods. And the road that you access Owl Woods off of, Marshall 40-foot road, it's become really degraded in recent years. So you're most likely not going to be able to drive that road unless you've got some sort of souped up 4x4. So you're most likely going to have to park at one end of the road and then walk up. It's about a 15 or 20 minute walk, and it gets pretty hard in some years when there's deep snow to walk through. It can be pretty tough. The woods itself, it's only about a 5 or 10 minute walk to follow the trail from the parking area, which of course that's if you can drive there. But from that parking spot, you walk through some hardwoods and then lots of patches of cedars, and then you get into the plantation, and that's only about a 5 or 10 minute walk. So it's not a big area to search, but you can spend a few hours walking through. The area you want to focus on is the plantation, and that's the best way to do that is just walk real slow and look at every tree, every conifer in there. You look at right up against the trunk. That's usually where owls are roosting, but you have to be very thorough. And it's very common for people to go in as a small group, 2 or 3 people, and the first 2 people look intently at a tree, and then the third person happens to notice there was an owl sitting there. So it's tricky, but it's well worth the effort. So the owls that are in the owl woods itself are usually sitting like this. This is a northern saw-whet owl, and they're usually right along the trunk. And I find the saw-whets are usually fairly low, kind of like 5 feet to 10 feet up in the tree. But this is the sort of search image you're looking for. In a sort of average to good year, there'd be 3 or 4 saw-whets. Maybe 2 to 4 saw-whets in an average to good year in the woods. So I mean, you can imagine trying to find basically a robin-sized bird sitting very still that's camouflaged. You're not guaranteed to see one, that's for sure. In really good years, there's you might find a boreal owl or 2. The most I've ever seen in the woods is 2, but that was a pretty good year. I don't think there's been a boreal owl for a few years in the owl woods, so you do have to get lucky. And then the other owl that one of the other owls you might find in the owl woods is long-eared owl. And in some years in the past, there's been 10 or 20 long-eared owls, and they're usually in groups, sort of roosting communally. And they often, I find, are roosting higher up in the trees than the saw-whet owls and the boreal owls. So those are the 3 main ones. The fourth is barred owl. I didn't put in a picture, but you might come across a barred owl roosting in the woods. Now the rest of the island is really good too. You can do the rest by car, and one of the birds that a lot of people are going to look for by car are short-eared owls. This photo's got 2 short-eared sitting on the posts, and there's a little blurry thing in the back there. That's actually a northern harrier. So you can get lots of hawks and owls hunting the farm fields. The short-eareds tend to favor fields that have sort of the long, weedy fields, long grass, weedy fields. And sometimes they're out hunting during the day, and sometimes they're out sitting like this. But often I find you have to wait pretty well till dark. I remember one time I was on Wolf Island, which is just one island over basically, looking for short-eared owls with my dad. And we didn't see a single short-eared owl all day. Then we missed the ferry that we were planning on taking. And so we were sort of stuck waiting for an hour for the next ferry to come along. So we drove around in the dark, and we found like 10 or 15 short-eared owls just with the headlights of the car. So it's worth staying right till dark, especially if you haven't seen any yet. Now, the other owl that you're likely to find in the open fields are snowy owls, and they're well known because a lot of people think of them as hunting during the day. They do hunt during the day sometimes, but they spend most of the day sitting, usually on the ground or on a small perch, like on the top of a hay bale here. It's often you can drive around the island and only see one or none. Um, and then as dusk approaches, all of a sudden you start seeing snowy owls everywhere. And those have just been ones sitting on the ground roosting for the day, and then they starting to get active as it's starting to get dark. So they hunt during the day, but they also mainly hunt at dusk and even at night. So be aware of that, and this is one to keep an eye out for as you're coming across on the ferry. Especially if there's ice, you'll sometimes see snowies sitting on the ice, um, and you can sometimes see two or three just coming across. And along with the hawks and owls that you're likely to see on the island in good small mammal years, you can also find decent numbers of northern shrikes, which, as I said earlier, is one of my favorite winter birds for sure. So keep an eye out for them on hydro wires and tops of little trees and shrubs as you're driving around. So I hope I've convinced you that winter birding's where it's at. There's some pretty amazing birds to see in Ontario in the winter, and we're really lucky. We've got a ton of absolutely world-class birding sites that we can get to easily and enjoy some pretty spectacular birds. So that's it for the presentation. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions?